We want to let you know that following our principle of democratizing the reflections and knowledge developed within CLAREC, our seminars are recorded and later shared on our social media. For those who haven't joined us before, let me briefly introduce our group CLAREC. CLAREC stands for the Cambridge Latin American Research in Education Collective, and its founding members are PhD students at the Faculty of Education at the University of Cambridge. CLAREC aims to constitute a space for Latin American perspectives that brings together researchers working on Latin American contexts and all those interested in hearing more about it. It aims to make visible the region's knowledge production and current debates linked to education research towards the diversification and decolonization of academia. Today, CLAREC is delighted to welcome Dr. Israel Moreno Salto and Professor Susan Robertson as our speakers. Professor Susan Robertson is head of the Faculty of Education at the University of Cambridge and Professor of Education Sociology. Her research focuses on education in a political context, including how education has developed to help service the economy, the commercialization of education, and the role of for-profit companies in the education sector. She is also editor-in-chief for Globalization, Societies, and Education, and editorial board member for Educational Researcher and Education Policy Analysis Archives, and an evaluator for the Horizon 2020 project. Her research has been published in a variety of journals, including Journal of Education Policy and British Journal of Sociology of Education. Dr. Israel Moreno Salto is a full-time lecturer in education sciences at the Autonomous University of Baja California in northern Mexico. He recently received his PhD in education from the Faculty of Education at the University of Cambridge under the supervision of Professor Susan Robertson. His research interests involve the governing of education, education policies, educational leadership, and teacher education. Thank you very much to both of you for sharing your work with us today. With today's seminar, CLAREC is launching a new initiative to host events led by graduates from the Faculty of Education, as is the case of Dr. Moreno Salto. We believe this series of events could be a great opportunity to strengthen our collaboration networks and host events that continue to build on CLAREC's objectives to represent, legitimize, and make visible knowledge, ideas, and current debates within Latin American contexts. So before giving the floor to our speakers, let me just say that Sebastian and Saldo will be in charge of the round of questions and answers that will take place after the presentation. So I want to invite our attendees to please write your questions in the general chat or directly to Sebastian, who will collect them and ask them to the speakers at the end of the presentation to optimize the time that we have. So Dr. Moreno Salto and Professor Robertson, the floor is all yours.
So I'm just going to start by saying this is Israel's research, and I happen to be the lucky supervisor of a piece of research, but where you also get to know something about a context, in this case, Mexico. I know Brazil much better. And actually, I just want to kind of acknowledge people that have popped up here today, particularly Artemio, who I knew studies Mexico, but is actually coming up to Cambridge to take up a post. So Artemio, great to see you. I knew you in Bristol, and also our wonderful colleague Mario de Azevedo, who's just come in from Brazil. Lovely to see you here, and I'll kind of stop that there. So I would just like to introduce the work, the paper actually that Israel is broadly going to speak to. And it's come out in a special issue of the journal Globalization, Societies and Education that I'm the founding editor of, but now co-edit with Mario Novelli, who himself actually is a Latin American scholar, and actually might be, he's just been working on social movement. So I would get him onto your list for CLAREC because he's continued to work particularly on Colombia, social movements and so on. The genesis for this special issue, before we get into Israel's research, was a kind of a group of us becoming, I think, kind of irritated is probably a word that I'm going to use, on the way in which the literature, particularly on the OECD, and focus specifically on PISA, which is the program of student assessment that got launched by the OECD in 2000. And it sort of got stuck like a record. And the record got stuck on a really nice piece, but nevertheless just an opening piece, in my view, on governing by numbers. Okay. And the OECD, of course, is governed by numbers, but it's governed by numbers over the course of its whole history, actually, since its inception in the early 1960s. And we'd been kind of looking at ways in which we might kind of commission pieces, more or less, or not commission, but invite pieces that did a kind of a rereading of the OECD, that might put on the table different methodologies for working on the OECD, let's say histories, different theoretical approaches, so that it moved itself away from this kind of stuck record, and went off in the direction of empirical work, because quite a lot of the governing by numbers stuff is simply discourse. Okay? Discourse reads the subject. And what you get with that, essentially, is almost a kind of paradoxical compounding of the power of the OECD. And yet, as Israel's going to reveal to you, if you took the case of Mexico, and I would actually want to invite all of you to particularly take note of the methodology that Israel is kind of deploying. One of the writers in the special issue, Jeremy Rapalai, who writes a lot on the OECD, looked at Israel and said, that's the PhD that I would have written if I could have. And that's great praise, actually, from Jeremy, because he's one of the leading scholars on PISA and the OECD. So in the invite, essentially, to reread the OECD, and I think there's 10 writers, probably the top writers, really, Soteria Grek, Christian Ydesen, Jeremy Rapalai, Komatsu, Daniel Trawler, who's done some fantastic, he's a historian. And what we did essentially is we kind of wrote a kind of a framing commissioning paper that then we returned to as part of the introduction for the special issue. And just very quickly, and then we'll go out to invite Israel to kind of take the conversation further, is to explore the changing capacities and positions of the OECD. So it starts with the rich countries, more or less, but essentially it's extensively widened its ambit to include low-income countries, PISA for development, baby PISA. Essentially, it's got these kind of products. And what we're interested in asking the writers to do is to actually look at, for example, styles of reasoning. How does the OECD even work? And it wasn't, many people wrote on PISA, but they didn't have to. You could be writing on TELUS, you could be looking at PISA for development. The paper I contributed was on global competences. What's the impact and wider implications, and to kind of play around with new methodologies and with different disciplines, as I've just kind of suggested. So that's just come out, and it's certainly already having quite a lot of impact. And what we wanted to do with that, positioning the special issue, is really kind of push the field forward in a much more kind of dramatic and radical way, away from the stuck record of governing by numbers. So I'm going to pass it across to Israel now, who's going to talk us through his PhD research. As a method, methodologically, it's a beautiful and beautifully executed piece of work. So congratulations to you, Israel, on doing that, because it was actually, as a multi-scalar kind of piece of work, that's not straightforward. It required a huge amount of field work and some different kind of angles in on things. So I'm going to pass the baton to you, Israel, and let you take that forward.
Thank you very much, Professor. I always say publicly that this couldn't have been possible without you. Buenos dias. Good morning here in Mexico. Thank you very much, CLAREC, for this invitation. I'm really happy to be here. So just for the sake of clarification, are you all able to see the presentation that's been projected? Okay, thank you very much. So yeah, we're going to open the conversation with some considerations. First of all, we want to thank the Mexican people for funding this research project through the National Council for Science and Technology. Second, the paper should be understood as a result of a sociology of education study, more specifically from the field of policy sociology or critical policy sociology. And third, this presentation should not be viewed as a comprehensive discussion of the paper, but rather an introduction, an invitation to explore it in further depth. This being said, the title of the paper, as you can recall from the first slide, is On the Life of Numbers in Governing Mexico's Education System, a multi-scalar account of the OECD's PISA. Our aim was to develop an empirically informed theoretical understanding of the life of PISA data as it circulates within or across the Mexican education system. Just in case, for those of you who are not familiar with PISA, PISA is the OECD's program for international student assessment. It measures 15-year-olds' ability to use their reading, mathematics, and science knowledge and skills to meet real-life challenges. The OECD assures that PISA generates data that can help improve policy and teaching practices. A little bit about Mexico. Mexico joined the OECD on May 18th, 1994, after this organization had withheld the incorporation of any new member for over 20 years. In the paper, you can read about a little bit more about this history and the context of the organization when it opened its doors to other countries, including those characterized as underdeveloped or poor countries. Mexico participated in the first PISA round, as Professor Robertson mentioned, in the year 2000, with 43 other countries. Today, over 90 nations and economies take part in this program, in this assessment. A little bit about Mexico's political and educational systems. The United States of Mexico, its full name, is a federal system made up of 32 states. It has 3 levels of government rule: the federal, the state, and the municipal. The governance of education, or what Roger Dale refers to as the funding, provision, and regulation of the education sector, is jointly carried out between the federal and state levels, except for one municipality in Mexico called Tijuana in northern Mexico, which has certain level of autonomy and is the only municipality in the country that has its own teachers, or a branch of municipal teachers. The education system is comprised of around 30 million students, and Mexico has taken part in different international large-scale assessments since the mid-90s, such as TIMSS, Ydesen, and ICAA. However, its history with domestic large-scale assessments date back to the late 70s. And also you can read a bit more about this history in the paper. As to the methodology, for this paper, we draw upon data from a larger study of large-scale assessments in Mexico, as Professor Robertson mentioned, that set out to explore and understand the life of large-scale assessment data, not just PISA, but also a national or domestic test called Planea, and a regional Latin American test called Ydesen, and how this data circulates within and across the Mexican education system at different scales. For this paper, three embedded units comprise the overall case study. For this paper, we touch upon only PISA data from the following sources. One, the local scale, policy documents, survey with 319 educators from primary, secondary, and upper secondary schools, semi-structured interviews with 29 teachers, head teachers, and superintendents. Two, the subnational scale, we draw upon policy documents, semi-structured interviews with 5 subnational and municipal officials. And three, the national scale, policy documents, semi-structured interviews with 6 members from the 2012 and 2018 Honorable Congress of the Union in Mexico. Once again, as I mentioned earlier, this constitutes a piece of critical policy sociology research. Regarding theoretical tools, here we draw upon 2 main sources. On the one hand, Marian Fourcade's work on category making and the principles of classificatory judgment, namely nominal, cardinal, and ordinal. And on the other hand, a part of Professor Robertson's work on competitive comparison. Here I share an important quote from Fourcade's work, where she states that she opens the paper asking, how do we know what we know? Quite simply, we learned it. We acquired words, concepts, and behaviors readily supplied by our social environment, sometimes forcibly, sometimes imperceptibly. Our sense of time and space, our perception of differences and similarities, our feelings about right and wrong, our deepest and most private emotions all came more or less naturally, more or less painfully, but always mediated by the effectuous power of language, our effectively charged interaction with others, and the demands of institutions. I find this quote quite relevant because part of our research was to explore how actors located at different scales made sense of PISA, of how did they understand it, what did they know about it, and what pieces or parts of PISA stuck with them. For this paper, instead of reporting each scale independently, we took a look at various activities and asked processual and relational questions about the life of PISA numbers, including who is to make use of what large-scale assessment, how, and with what outcomes. For this, we draw 3 vantage points. So the first vantage point, do teachers know about PISA and how do they use PISA results? Survey results indicate that 66.1% do know about PISA, 33.9% have no knowledge, 37.6% basic knowledge, 24.1% intermediate, and 4.4% advanced. Results also indicate differences of PISA knowledge among groups of teachers according to their workplace. We found statistical differences between, for example, the proportion of students from primary and secondary schools who knew this program. Actually, we also found that teachers from the early years of primary education are less likely to know about PISA, contrasted against their peers from secondary or upper secondary education. We also found modest levels of reading regarding PISA publications, both from international sources like the OECD or a national, like the National Institute for Education Evaluation. Nevertheless, key PISA issues noted by teachers or emphasized by teachers through interviews were keywords like ranking, score averages, and comparisons. Our second vantage point, do policymakers in Mexico use large-scale assessment like PISA, and how? Here there was an emphasis on one particular piece of legislation, the General Law for the Professional Teaching Service. Research findings indicate that Mexican legislators have some broad understanding of PISA, mainly related to its aims in Mexico test scores in comparison to other countries. However, for this particular piece of legislation, decision-making or voting in relation to this, the General Law for the Professional Teaching Service, was heavily influenced, if not dictated, by their political powers. Parties, sorry. The linkages between PISA and this law, however, lie in the 2013 education reform, which is the mother law for the professional teaching service initiative. Actually, the General Law for the Professional Teaching Service comes to regulate the dispositions mandated in the 2013 education reform, or at least part of it. The rationale for this 2013 reform bill draws heavily on PISA data to show or persuade the reader regarding the low levels of education quality in Mexico. Mexico's ranked positions in comparison to its main economic partners and neighbors, an urgency to employ measures to reduce proportions of students who perform poorly on PISA, and the probable national risk linked to this extension of low PISA performance. In our interviews, Congress members agree that these issues, or agree on these issues brought up by the reform bill, and call upon them to justify their decision or their votes in the General Law for Professional Teaching Service legislative process. Vantage point 3, does a subnational scale state use large-scale assessments in their education decision-making, and so is it influenced by PISA? And here we raised an important question. Does this level act as a buffer between the bottom and the top? Does it prioritize PISA in any way, or are other large-scale assessments important in its policy making? And here we emphasized on one particular policy, namely the Early Years Quality Initiative, developed at and for the preschool education levels, developed by state and municipal education authorities. Here, participants made it clear that they did not consider PISA useful, as that PISA is not administered to preschool students. They turned to Excale, a form of domestic large-scale assessment developed by the National Institute of Education and Evaluation, which actually is linked to the OECD and the indicator development culture that they prompted in the early 90s, and came to its maximum point with the launch of PISA in the year 2000. In this sense, we argue that the OECD's PISA echoes down into the level of preschool education in a rather unexpected, though very influential, backdoor fashion. Here we draw some broad concluding discussions. Professor Robertson, would you like me to share these, or would you like to? Okay, so I'll just briefly mention these.
Sorry, I think Susan is muted, so we could hear her. Sorry.
No, so Israel, you go, and then I can weigh in once the questions start.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Professor. Just drawing some broad concluding discussions. we come to realize that what teachers do take from PISA is where Mexico is located in relation to other countries in the region. In this sense, our empirics confirm that competitive comparisons is a key modality at work that mediates the power of numbers. However, it is a placing of Mexico in an ordinal classificatory system that triggers this competitive comparison. Our research suggests teachers buy into the OECD's vertical vision of the world and are easily able to articulate that Mexico's scores are below Chile, but above Colombia and Peru. This kind of vertical vision sets in motion an endless race to the top, kept in place by annual cycles of representing and presenting the winners and would-be winners, the mobilization of affect and an economy of worth and value. PISA was used by the Congress members, but largely to legitimate their own views as to who was to blame for the state of education affairs in Mexico, and thus the place of Mexico in the global economy. In this moment, numbers are mobilized to support their view as to who is really to blame for structural inequalities. In signaling out teachers and head teachers, this now relocates responsibility and thus accountability, and doing so limits any critical investigation into the structural inequalities in Mexico that are responsible. PISA data is now weaponized and the power of the OECD amplified because such instrumental decisions by the politician generates level of visibility for PISA that otherwise would not be there. Now, the Early Years Quality Initiative promotes a different kind of early years learner identity through the creation of nominal categories and these different tools proposed by 4K. As I briefly mentioned in the at the beginning of this presentation, it's just an introduction to the paper. It shouldn't be considered as a comprehensive review, and we look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you so much, Israel and Susan, for this interesting presentation. We are open in the chat for your question. I will start with something that I think it's really interesting for me in my research, and it's more about the micro levels of this research. And you mentioned that Israel, sorry, you mentioned that PISA might promote some type of vertical vision of education and maybe an international competition, like a sense of education. Did you observe this like in the discourse of teachers, and how maybe this shape their practices in the classroom?
Thank you very much for your question, Sebastian. Yeah, actually, if we draw on the presentation, we can see that some of these keywords, ideas, notions of competition, of rankings are actually the issues that stick with teachers, are the issues that they pay attention to. And in doing so, this shifts to some extent their practice, their teaching practices, to allocate importance or relevance to attending competition, raising scores, and so on and so forth. Yeah, of course. Thank you.
Can I just come in and make a couple of remarks? I mean, one of the things that Andreas Schleicher, who at one point described himself as the Global Secretary for Education, which is an amazing kind of moment of hubris. But on many of the presentations, he would have it as the last slide. Without data, all you have are opinions. Okay, and so the whole question of do teachers make use of this data, which actually is kind of translated into handbooks for teachers, isn't it, Israel? To be there, available, teachers should be using, consulting, and so on. And this is an incredibly expensive exercise for Mexico that puts, because PISA now is it's a commercial product, and as the cycles of PISA are kind of ticking over, and so on. So the whole question then of what's happening to the data and where does it turn up and how becomes a really important question. And yet at the same time, my sense, Israel, would be that actually, nevertheless, what's driving this is not so much data, but actually opinions to some extent, formed through these kind of vertically organized, kind of scales, essentially, that put all countries into some kind of equivalence with each other, despite the really significant inequalities across all of the 90 countries that kind of make up the kind of PISA countries. So the work that Israel's been doing is to actually show how different, actually, how big the difference is, how big the gap is between what's happening to these this data, numbers, that kind of thing, and essentially what the narrative is that the OECD kind of present. So to some extent, it stands aside from the governing by numbers that just assumes that actually that the production of PISA always has effects on schools and kind of predictable effects, to looking at the unexpected life of numbers as you kind of trace them through these different kinds of scales or entry points or connections to old kind of OECD related tests, for example, with the early years work that you did. I think, if I kind of sum that up, Israel, kind of well enough in your view?
Yes, absolutely, Professor. Thank you. Thank you very much for these insights. Sorry, I was reading the chat. We have a couple of questions there.
Yes, thank you. We have a question, maybe more like about the theoretical stance from Keith Taber. Thank you, very interesting. This is peripheral to your central concerns, so please only respond if there are no more relevant questions. The forecast quote seems to reject place for any form of innate knowledge provided by our common genetic inheritance. I wonder if you subscribe to that.
I'll have a think about it, Keith. I think you're right, but at the same time, she's a sociologist or an economist turned sociologist, so we're not surprised by her observations. But I think what she is trying to point to essentially is, the significance of when she's actually thinking about the kind of different ways in which we learn the world and the categories, the nominal, for example, the identities of categories, which Bernstein would also be kind of pointing to, and it's kind of quite attentive to some extent to the transitive kind of world of things. So I think perhaps I'll let you muse over that, Keith, as a typical and very thought-provoking question that we don't have the answer for the moment. We'll think about it and come back to you.
Thank you, Susan. Do you want to add something to that, Israel? Perfect. We have another question from Ricardo Sabates. I want to congratulate Israel for the outstanding doctoral work. My question for the authors are, is there a value for large-scale assessments? If so, who should be leading on the development of such assessments and what the value of these assessments should be? Thank you for an excellent presentation.
So Israel, let me just draw you into a conversation. So the bigger PhD thesis looked at 3 different kinds of large-scale assessments. One was a national assessment, one was a regional assessment, and the final one was the global, which is the PISA. And I guess we had discussions, didn't we, Israel, around the extent to which the regional one, Latin American, was very much around a kind of human rights kind of assessment. The OECD is, because it's organized vertically, it's vertical vision, kind of competition. Okay, how do you learn what to learn? You learn essentially from losing. Okay, so this is competition driving it. Whereas the national assessment had tended to be much more kind of pedagogical. And I think that the thing that actually the three large scale assessments that Israel that you're looking at then almost reveal different program ontologies, that you can actually have large scale assessments, but it depends on how you actually want to represent, let's say in the case of the OECD, it's brought into competitive comparison. And essentially, and as Michael Sandel's, who's written a wonderful book on meritocracy most recently, what you learn from that is who becomes a winner and who becomes a loser. And what you also learn is that structural inequalities are regarded as not important. Essentially, if you basically run an ordinal system of equivalences, 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5, and you go all the way down, you learn two things. One is that you're all supposedly in a flat earth competition, which clearly not every country is, at the same level of development, with the same levels of investment in education, with the same kinds of socioeconomic and political kind of infrastructures. And then, let me just put my phone down. And then the other thing that you kind of learn is that is the only game in town, winning or losing, okay? And the collateral damage from that is incredibly high, and so on. So, but could you say something then? You focused on this because it's the OECD kind of special issue. I've got a phone caller. I'm putting the phone down twice. But the other large scale assessments reveal something different, Israel.
Yes, thank you very much for these comments, Professor, and thank you very much to Ricardo Sabates. For all of you, Ricardo was my advisor, and we had plenty of heated conversations. When I first started my PhD, I remember that I attended a conference at the IOE in London, and I shared a table with Sam Seller. Sam Seller is also a leading scholar in the OECD, or the work of governance and the OECD in education. And that was actually the last question that we had to discuss within the tables, the value of that particular time in PISA. And I remember that my answer is that for me, it didn't have any value. It didn't, at that time, that was my question. And I think that was related to what drew me into PISA, or studying PISA. Back in 2015, I was working at a secondary school. One day we were communicated that our school had been selected as part of the national PISA sample. So the subnational authorities came to the school. They had this meeting. They informed us that we were going to participate in PISA and asked us to train our students, to prepare them for the test. So my first question was, why should we prepare them for the PISA test? Doesn't this go against the nature of the test? What we want is the accuracy of how our students are doing in relation to the development of these competencies that they're supposed to gain at the end of their secondary education. So everyone looked at me as if I was asking the wrong question, or I was from another planet. And they made it clear that it was in the best interest of everyone that our students perform the best that they could. So at that moment, that action instigated the scientific curiosity that brought me to study PISA. Today, I can say, after doing this PhD, that I do believe that large-scale assessments have value, but I completely agree with Professor Robertson. Professor Robertson's view and take on these issues. This value will depend on how these large-scale assessments are used, employed, especially talking about their outcomes, and particularly the stance that their hosts take on the use of their outcomes. For example, the OECD knows that many countries, knows that many education systems misuse their outcomes and develop these league tables and so on and so forth. And they do frown upon it, but they mention it, but it's part of. I think that their attitude is more okay. So this is going to happen. So they shouldn't do it, but they don't really get into these discussions about the limitations or the misuses of their data, and they just let groups and people reproduce them. So yeah, so I think that the host of these large-scale assessments should have a larger ethical responsibility with the outcomes of their tests, and in terms of discourse, I think that they also have the need to recognize the limitations and the actual extent of the use of their data. For example, in the OECD case in PISA, they claim a large amount of uses for their data, but actually, when you start asking questions, I'll put an example. The OECD claims that PISA data is useful for policy development. But when you start asking questions and you start exploring policy making processes, one of the basic issues is that first and foremost, you have different policymakers. In my PhD thesis, you have legislators, and then you have policymakers from the Secretariat of Education. So how is a standardized form of data like the one produced by PISA useful for these different audiences? And what is the OECD and other large-scale assessment hosts doing to meet the needs of these different audiences? In a sense, it would be like a same currency for two different sets of needs. So yeah, in that sense, I do believe that large-scale assessments are valuable now that I've completed my PhD. But I think that large-scale assessment hosts should pay way much more attention to these issues.
Can I just add one thing? I mean, Mexico, like Australia, Canada, Germany, these are federal systems. So education itself is constitutionally, typically, the United States too, either local or at least subnational. In the case of Mexico, it's at the level of the state, same in Australia. But yet what you get is one single national figure, as if education across all of that kind of jurisdiction. I mean, it's a profound case of methodological nationalism in many senses that erase the kind of huge differences that you would find across federal systems, for example. And it has resulted to some extent in the OECD, in some cases, looking at territory or economy within a nation state kind of space. But for the moment, the way the national figure sits, it essentially sits as one figure in a kind of global ranking system that essentially you would have to say, how is that useful for teachers or subnational policy making when essentially it's not able to kind of speak to the diversity of the political arrangements on the one hand, the very different socioeconomic kind of circumstances on the other hand, and so on. So that would be also some of the kind of issues that begin to emerge with this kind of mechanism of governing.
Thank you so much, Susan and Israel. I think this is a related question, and it has to do with the uses and maybe symmetries or asymmetries between the OECD and national authorities. It's from Javiera. I thank you so much for the presentation. I would like to ask if the authorities' level of engagement with PISA in policy making, even if instrumental, relates to a substantive agreement with the OECD approach to education and its idea regarding what constitutes education quality, or is about having the numbers coming from the assessment, regardless of what they mean.
Israel, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. If I understand correctly, the question, I'm going to take a minute just to read it from the chat. Yeah, yes. From my point of view, policymakers do share the view of the OECD's approach to education. In short, yeah.
Can I just chip in though? It's very interesting. So most recently, the OECD and its 2018 PISA data collection has gone off and now collected what's called PISA. It's global competence data, and now suddenly there's a kind of major storm confronting the OECD, because for the first time it's gone off in the direction of it's always put its head down and done, what you would see as, numbers, technical and so on. But with global competences, it's into the territory called culture. And 50% or less than half of the OECD countries, they had to pay for the data collection, but they didn't collect the data. And when you actually go and look at the global competences kind of data that's being presented, it's complete rubbish. It's nonsense, it's rubbish. And what's interesting about all the national teams, and some of them have actually been leaking it, is that they there've been huge rows in the national teams with the OECD about really what is a kind of a particular kind of view and take on the world, and it becomes much more visible when you're looking at something like culture. Okay? So to some extent, we can kind of see almost the limits to PISA at the moment. It's kind of normalized its data collection around, just the three areas actually: science, literacy, and mathematical knowledge. None of the other knowledges are kind of being collected. But when now we get to the collection of data on culture and notions of cultural and intercultural competences and so on, its kind of take on culture is highly provincial. In other words, it's a very US kind of centric kind of understanding. And you begin to kind of see essentially that is also where the OECD, which one of its largest funders is actually the US, kind of in there. So to some extent, it seems to me that the authority of the OECD is kind of running into kind of fairly tricky kind of territory now with the global competences, which it wants to kind of roll out to, suck up what it sees as kind of some of the difficulties around social inequalities, growing social inequalities, and so on. So, I mean, it's a wonderful question around authority, and I think, but also all governors need to legitimate their authority, and the question of how do you legitimate that authority so that you can continue to govern, I think, is the interesting kind of question.
Thank you. Sorry.
No, I was just going back to the question, and just briefly to comment that in a sense, the OECD through PISA and its different tools in Mexico make visible this apparent low quality of education. So it's kind of a cycle, Javiera. They make it visible, then this reinforces, this creates an image in the authorities' mind, and then come the numbers and reinforce this. And this is a cycle that Susan talks about in when she refers to vertical vision or competitive a comparison. In another view, Benavent and I can't remember the other author, but argue that PISA has become the global arbiter diagnostician and judge of the education systems around the world, in this sense, providing the diagnosis, the collecting the data, and providing the remedy or the solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Israel and Susan. An interesting question about the reaction of important agents or actors in this process. I also, it's from Marta Cristina Azaola. I also would like to say that this was a very interesting reading. My question is whether teachers have something to say about PISA results being used by policymakers to blame them for the state of Mexican education.
That's yours, Israel.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. Actually, it wasn't addressed in the thesis as part of the interview scripts, but there were comments in relation to politicians or education authorities not being sensible to the needs of teachers or the reality of teachers or the condition of learning in Mexico. Yeah, but I mean, it's a very interesting question that we could look into.
Yep, thank you. And we have a related question also about teachers from Artemio Cortez. Thank you for your presentation and congratulations on the paper. My question is, what are the implications for the research for initial teacher education, especially regarding bottom-up? Example, given teachers' responses to LSA, such as PISA. Are teachers currently equipped with the skills to read PISA critically and hence respond to education reform?
That's also a wonderful question. Thank you very much, Artemio. Actually, at this time, we're writing a book chapter on the relationship between the 2013 education reform in Mexico and its influence on the 2018 teacher education reform, and the connection with PISA and the OECD. So yeah, be aware of that chapter for, I think maybe next year.
Ellie Tai, who was with us earlier, but she's doing, I can see she's gone, but she's in Taiwan, so she's probably close to midnight now. But essentially her research is actually looking at English teachers and what they do and don't know about PISA, because it profoundly affects, the prepping that goes on, the PISA testing, pre-prepping testing and that kind of thing. But in many senses, what Ellie can actually tell you is that English teachers, for example, know very little about something that's incredibly impactful on them. And I think so the teacher education question is actually about an education question about how to critique large-scale assessments, how to advocate for large-scale assessments that actually don't have the kinds of problems built in. Most recently, a victim of COVID, Harvey Goldstein, who wonderful educator, statistician, would actually make that kind of point. You can have kind of governing strategies and numbers and so on, large scale assessments, where essentially you could drive effective reform, and teachers would actually have the kind of data that might be able to be used at the level of teachers. But in many senses, if you think of, to some extent, when that data is being represented nationally, how could teachers actually, with national data, say something about the a rural, quite marginalized education offer in somewhere like Mexico, when basically essentially it's a kind of specific kind of national figure. So kind of a critical literacy amongst teachers, where teachers actually might be able to recover something about their professional judgments, and we see this right at the moment taking place, to do with can you trust teachers to actually make professional judgments about students and their learning and so on? And there's a kind of nervousness here in England about that question. But what if we actually started with the development of teachers' professional judgment and their confidence about knowing their students, and actually, as a number of different countries do, put your faith in teachers as professionals and their judgments and so on. And they're two different kinds of narratives. One's a very low trust narrative, which is the OECD. You can't trust teachers, you have to trust the OECD. The other one's a high trust narrative, which actually would take you back into, it seems to me, quite a different accountability kind of regime.
Thank you. I think we have time for the last question. And maybe this is again about some of the practices in classrooms in the school, and maybe it's about the curriculum or hidden curriculum that the impact with PISA. It's from Elisa de Padua. Did you have the chance to explore the impact of PISA on what is taught inside the classrooms?
So Israel, that's over to you.
Yeah. It was quite interesting because when you ask teachers about the actual use of PISA data or PISA outcomes in their daily practice, they tend to avoid the question or answer or provide an answer to other issues rather than to explicitly say how is it that this outcome that the OECD claims that can be used by teachers for improving their teaching practices occurs. They don't really provide a robust or comprehensive answer to this question. Rather, we can see that the effect of PISA data on teaching is secondary and has to do more with the pressure that they feel to comply with these standards, is that they modify their practices to comply with what standardized standardized tests are requiring. This at the micro level, at the classroom level. At the more macro level, we can see that in Mexico, for example, the last curriculum reform in 2016 includes some recommendations of the OECD, especially what has to do with curricular autonomy, giving schools. In Mexico, the curriculum is centralized at the federal level. So we have one curriculum for the entire nation, instead of like, let's say the US, where each district decides their curriculum. In Mexico, it's not like that. In Mexico, the Secretariat or the National Secretariat of Education decides the curriculum for the entire nation. So in the 2016 reform, we can see that they open a small space within the national curriculum, and they call it curricular autonomy, and they give schools the opportunity to decide part of the curriculum or their syllabus. I mean, just a little small space. And this decision was actually taken because and they justify it in the document on the OECD, in one of their publication claims that schools that have this curricular autonomy perform better than other schools in the US in PISA. So yeah, so you can find that rationale and how it's influencing the transformation of teaching. But that's more indirectly than directly.
Thank you for everything. I think we're ready with the question and answers. Thank you, Israel and Susan.
Thanks, Sebastian. And
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much to our speakers for a fantastic session on the life of PISA numbers at different levels of the Mexican education system. And thank you to our attendees for your attention and for your thoughtful questions. We hope you enjoyed the seminar as much as we did. Before we conclude the session very fast, we want to invite you to our next event that will take place next Monday, in which we will be talking with Professor Walter Mignolo about the idea of Latin America and the possibilities of the decolonial epistemic turn in the present. And please do not forget to follow CLAREC's social media to keep informed about these and future events. This is all for today's seminar. Thank you very much to everyone, and we hope to see you again very, very soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Many thanks.
Gracias, thank you.